Thank you very much. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Peter. It's great to be able to speak to the society tonight. I've, I was going to say, and thank you for hosting me online. I know you normally do these in person, but as it happens, I've probably gone down with the dreaded COVID, so it's probably good I'm not with you in person. So apologies if I splutter through this and cough, but I'll try to make myself heard. I'm hoping you can all see the slideshow now. Stick something in the chat if it's not working, and if you can't hear me, it's probably you, not me. So yeah, Liz invited me to speak on the Colchester Vase tonight, and this is obviously one of the star objects in the Gladiators of Britain touring exhibition, which I was really fortunate to be a co-curator on when I was at Colchester Museums. It's already had two iterations. I've not managed to get to Chester yet. I believe you've got one of the smallest spaces, but I imagine, and apparently I've been told, it still looks fantastic. And of course, you've got an amazing collection there, which is enhancing the exhibition. So as Liz outlined, this exhibition came about because we'd put on a Gladiators exhibition at Colchester, and we'd been in conversation with the British Museum for some time, and it came about that we could create this touring exhibition, all the things lined up. And it's been a fantastic experience. So it's already been to Dorset. I mean, again, I don't know if any of you have been down there, but it's been to Dorset, it's been to Northampton, it's now at Chester in the Grosvenor, and it'll be moving on to Tully House Museum at some point. And sorry, I'm just going to move you all over here. What it's trying to do, this exhibition, is really focus on the reality of spectacular, so the spectacles within the arenas of Britain. I think sometimes we can see Britain through the lens of Rome, and especially when we think of the spectacles, I think we can get a very different view and interpretation of what went on here. However, it can also flip to the other end of that spectrum, and we suddenly get the impression that maybe none of this happened, maybe none of the grandeur and literally what the word means, the spectacle, was the same as we see elsewhere in the provinces or indeed at Rome. And that's not quite the case either. So tonight, I want to focus on a singular object. So that is the Colchester Vase. And I'm going to round up tonight's talk by just picking out a couple of other objects that are on display in the exhibition that I think start to paint a very different picture. And hopefully, if you can attend the exhibition, you probably already have, but if you can get there, hopefully these, not only do these objects really stand out to you, but you'll start to see we've got a really interesting array of evidence that speaks to the reality of gladiator spectacle and other events in the arenas across the country. And not least to say, I should say that there are some of the most impressive, interesting and important objects in this exhibition. And I doubt these objects will come together, in the next 10, 20, 30 years again. So I do urge you to go and see these things. It's a really special display. And of course, it's also being reinterpreted at each venue. So, what's going on at Chester and the Grosvenor, it'll be different when it goes to Tully, and it's been a different interpretation at the other two sites, drawing on the local collections. And you've got some really special material in Chester, partly because you've got a fantastic amphitheatre, and we'll come on to that in a bit. So let's get into it. So reinterpreting the Colchester Vase. So we have the vase on the right here. It's a star object in this exhibition. It was discovered at it's an area known as West Lodge, but Lexton in 1853. So it's what we'd call an antiquarian find. And as you can see on the map here, I've highlighted the area. This is the area that Rex Hull, what Colchester Museums defined as sort of the Western Cemetery. Now, if in sort of Roman times, cemeteries weren't really clearly defined like this. I mean, we use modern descriptions like northern, southern, western cemeteries if we find them outside major cities. So the same happens at London, for instance. We've got the Western Cemetery, the Eastern Cemetery, but really these are organically growing necropoli, and the Romans wouldn't have sort of bounded them in. So this is a modern term, but it's a helpful term. And within this cemetery, we have some of the most important people being buried at Colchester and very early on. So if you know of the famous tombstone of Facilis, he's buried here, not far away. You get the famous child's grave with all those amazing pipe clay figurines. This is a really, really rich cemetery area. And back in the day, antiquarian collectors were sort of digging up their back gardens and finding these amazing burial assemblages. And one of these included the Colchester Vase. So as you walked along the road to Londinium, or you left Colchester, Camulodunum, you would have seen all these tomb markers, these amazing structures, not really that different from what you'd see at Rome along the Appian Way and other major Roman centres across the empire. So in terms of then acquiring the vase, we've got this amazing drawing in the Colchester Museum's collections by Josiah Parish, which is absolutely fantastic. And he records in detail how it was found. So we assumed to some degree he was either there when it was found or very soon after. And what's not always known is that the vase was found with a mortarium, which was used as a lid, one of these straight-sided mortaria, and a little flagon and a samian dish, which is fantastic for a bit of dating. So we've got an assemblage of this late 2nd century to early 3rd century AD. Interestingly, I'll come into it in a minute, the inscription. So the vase has been reused as a cremation vessel. So I'll come back to that later in the talk. And it's decorated with 3 scenes, which includes a venatio, I spelled that wrong, which is sort of a beast hunt or an animal fight of some description, and a munus. So this is the gladiatorial fight. So munus loosely meaning something like gift. And I'm sure a number of you know that gladiator fights and combats sort of either originated with the Etruscans or came from southern Italy, and they sort of originated around sort of funerals. They were gifts to the people, or public spectacle, a gift to the deceased. But I think that's a very different context when we're looking at 2nd and 3rd century AD Britain. And the thing I was going to just say, there's this amazing inscription around the rim of the pot as well, naming the performers that you can see here on the vase, which interestingly is completely covered by the mortaria when you stick it on top. And I have to say, when we displayed it at Colchester, potentially for the first time, we had it with its mortaria on top of it, which I think was brilliant. But to show it off in its glory, it's not touring with these other objects, nor is it touring, I should say, with the cremated remains inside. So I just want to, we're focusing tonight on this one object, and I'm going to show you how we can ring a single object with so much information. And this has been a fantastic project, really, to explore this one object in detail. It's a real passion of mine as a museum curator to do this with old collections, sort of shine new light on old collections and see, can we say anything different? And the Colchester Vase really has exploded in that sense. So I want to give a bit of background tonight around its history, its biography of it as it sort of left the ground, so to speak. So we're going to start with how it's donated to the museum. So this is John Taylor. So he's one of the major antiquarians that forms the backbone of the historic Colchester Museum's collections, the Roman collections. And as I've already said, it's been on display a long time, 164 years to date. And we assume it's been on display for that amount of time. Before 2024, it only left the museum once. That was a short trip to Burlington Fine Arts Club in London, and this is at the request of Mortimer Wheeler. And interestingly, I've pulled it out of this document here, and I should say there's all this documentation associated with the vase in what we call a history file, and museums across the country have historic history files. So that's where you put anything relating to an object. They're sort of becoming more digital nowadays, but they are absolute mine of information. No one had really looked at this letter, for instance, till I started this project. And Wheeler in there says, I think that in spite of all temptations in other directions, we had, on the whole, better have the Gladiator vase. After all, it is about the best of its kind in the country. Even though made abroad, it comes within our scope. So Wheeler is trying to get the vase off display for a short period of time from Wrexhall. Couple of things here we're going to return to. One is it's one of the best of its kind, or maybe not the best, so we'll come back to that. Is it the best made pot in Roman Britain? And we'll also come back to it's a shame that it was made abroad. Well, was it? So there we go. So there's a bit of some famous individuals, if you want to call them that, wrapped up with this object. And it's worth very quickly going over its sort of previous publication and research. So despite this being, a star object in Colchester Museum's collection, and I have to say, if you're going to do it like a top 100 objects from Roman Britain, it would absolutely be in there. but it hasn't had a lot of attention. And that's, to me, that's really interesting. When I first joined Colchester Museums, I was staggered by the collection on display in the Colchester Castle Museum, which is brilliant to stay still holding up. I think it's over 10 years old, that display, but still holds up, still looks really good. And when I came to the vase, I mean, I couldn't believe it. I just thought it was fantastic. And I'd not really come across it before, which is perhaps odd as a Roman curator in some senses. We'll come on to it in a bit, but I also stood on tiptoes, and that's when I first noticed it held a cremation inside, which is not really mentioned in any of the published literature. So here we go. Here's a very slim pamphlet, catalogue of antiquities in the Colchester Museum. Now, Colchester Museums, unlike many of sort of the Roman cities, towns out there in Britain, doesn't have an antiquarian catalogue. So I believe like Chester has one. I know, the British Museum does, the London Museum, as it was called and is now called again. You'll find these very old museum catalogues that just, give a sense of the collection at that time. And Colchester doesn't really have that. It sort of has that wrapped up in a book by Thomas May exploring the pottery, but the focus there is on the pottery and not other material remains. So it's never had that. And I wonder if that's what's caused this eclipse, really. What else have we got? Well, we've got another small pamphlet, so written by the Clarks, and David Clark was a curator and museum manager at Colchester Museum. So here it is. It's got excuse the pixelation. It features in his little, and again, these are pamphlets, really, a few pages long, these publications. It is, of course, mentioned by Jocelyn Toynbee, Art in Roman Britain, but it only gets, a catalogue entry, although Toynbee is the first to make reference to some really interpretations about the vase. That's back in 1972. Now, if you've not, if these names haven't meant much to you so far, I imagine the next name might, Tony Wilmot, because of the fantastic work he's done on the Chester Amphitheatre. And this was the subject of a paper he put out. He's exploring it's the slate depiction of a Retiarius, isn't it, which will be on display in your exhibition, and we had on loan when we did Colchester's exhibition. And here he discusses the possibility of two left-handed gladiators, and you can just see it there. There's Memnon, he's the secutor, the heavily armored gladiator, wielding his weapon in the left hand, and he argues about how this pot is produced, and are we seeing a real left-hander here, not a reverse image, if you see what I mean. So aside from that, that's the publication record on the vase, one of the most amazing Roman pots, etc., in the country. So having stood on tippy toes in the museum and discovered there was a cremation inside, and there were a number of cremations at that time on display in Colchester museums, this really, for me, sparked an interest. And I did wonder whether these cremations were original to the pottery vessels and whether we could explore anything. I used to work at the Museum of London before Colchester. I'm really privileged to have osteological curators on staff there, Yelena Beklevac and Becky Redfern, leading the Centre for Human Bioarchaeology. So I had a good idea of what we could do with human remains, cremations, in terms of their study and what they could tell us. To cut a long story short, we created a project that was funded between 2020 and 2021 called Decoding the Dead. And this was with the University of Reading, working with Professor Hella Eckhart, and had lots of support from Durham University and other external specialists. And within this study, we included the cremation from the Colchester Vase, even though we were looking at earlier cremations in the collection, because of course this is a 2nd to 3rd century AD cremation. We undertook scientific analysis of as many antiquarian cremation vessels as possible that survived. Had a number of outputs. I don't know, some of you may have come down to see the Decoding the Dead exhibition. We did a History Hit podcast. We did a film with them. That was brilliant for promoting this. There's a Future Learn course, which I think is still going, and it's really popular. So have a look out for that, called Dead Interesting. And there's an academic paper, which is still in prep, but hopefully we'll get there. I can come back to that later. That is going to wrap all this up. So this was funded by Arts Council England's designation scheme at the time, with input from Colchester Museums, I think to the tune of something like 80 to 100,000 pounds, but that had to employ project officers, specialists, did an exhibition, we did all this content. So we actually got a huge amount for our money there and an amazing insight into the collection. So that's a bit of background to what went on. Reasons for undertaking the research, and here you can see the Colchester vase in all its glory, and we've recreated the image of it with its little mortarium lid, if you like, and the flagon and Samian vessel. Well, arguably this vessel is one of the most famous depictions of gladiators from Roman Britain, and I think coupled with that, it's arguably the best pot made from Roman Britain. And it's not me who said that, it's Joanna Bird. I don't even know of her. She's a pottery specialist, been working with Samian ware, that lovely red glossy Samian ware. We can see that in the little dish down there on the right. And she's seen a lot of pots. Now, I know we dig up a lot of pots from Roman Britain, and complete pots must still number in their thousands, tens of thousands if you want to go into archaeological archives and stores across the country. But there is something really exceptional about the execution of this pot and its decoration. And if you've seen it in the flesh and you can compare it to other things like Nene Valley ware that's decorated in a similar style, you can sort of see it for yourself. And there's a reason for this. So what I did is I assembled a little research team around this. So Nina Crummy, who's an artifact specialist, who was able to bring on Joanna Bird, and who's a Samian or a pottery specialist, and John Pearce, who is a specialist in the study of Roman death and burial, as well as being an epigraphist. He worked on the Vindolanda tablets early on, and he also, if you read the Journal Britannia, does the roundups of finds each year in there. So a great spectrum of people here to bring on to see what we could find out new about the vase if we just looked at it very carefully, really. The result of this work has just been published. It took a long time, 2 papers in the end, and it was fantastic that the journal Britannia would accept 2 papers. And I really think that says something about this object as well. And, it's a singular object that has generated 2 papers worth of study and information and looking at it again. So again, this is great for me as a museum curator, looking at objects that may have not had the light shone on them in the way they should have. I thought this was a brilliant output, and hopefully, I should say, these are open access, so you can read these. Hopefully, of interest to people, and hopefully, we make some good cases for its reinterpretation. So Nina and Joanna looked at the production of the pot, if you like, and then the interpretation of the decoration. And myself and John tried to reinterpret what does this represent then? How does it fit into Colchester and the wider picture of gladiators in Britain? So I'm going to go over their research, and I've tried to acknowledge them here to try and give you an overview of those papers and what really stands out and why it's important. On the right here, we have this is a brilliant all on canvas by Alma Tadema. I'll talk about this in a minute, but I don't know if you can see in the middle there this lovely pot, which is a charioteer. And that pot is a real life pot. It's from Colchester, but currently in the British Museum's collections. So this is a fantastic representation, made up representation of Hadrian's visit to England and coming to Roman pottery. So potters were active in Colchester before the Roman conquest, all the way through to the 4th century AD. Pottery is a massive industry around Colchester, and that's represented in the many number of kilns that are discovered there. A recent site that was excavated by the Colchester Archaeological Trust, in fact, I think I think they might have stopped digging now, they're certainly still processing, near the old hospital site, has revealed more and more and more kilns. So this is big business for Colchester throughout the Roman period and just before. Colchester kilns producing a really wide range of pottery types and fabrics, and they include specialist ware. So that would be Samian, so lovely red glossy ware, and color-coated wares, that's quite a general term there, and mortaria. So we've already seen one of those, the lid to the Colchester vase. But the distribution of these products is pretty limited. It's not the same as the Nene Valley ware, which has a much wider production area, sort of all parts of Britain, really. The vase itself, and we saw Wheeler earlier, didn't we? In that letter referred to this. He says it's not a British product, and it was originally thought to be either a Nene Valley or a German product at that time. However, we asked the pottery specialist at the Trust, Colchester Archaeological Trust, Dr. Matt Loughton, to analyse it again, and he confirms that it's local clay. I say confirm because Rex Hull had already stated this in his book on the pottery kilns from Colchester. And that's interesting. We've talked about the publication record here of the vase, because it's just not something that sort of has kept on. We would still find people referring to it as a possible, foreign product. And it just shows you sometimes how things stick to an object or an interpretation archaeologically. But we reconfirm this. This is definitely a vase, a pot that was made locally. It's local clay made in the kilns. And then, somewhat ironically, these kilns are located to the west of the town. That's where it ends up being buried as well. So it doesn't travel very far in its lifetime. And then right at the end, I don't know if you can clock it. You won't be able to see it, I'm sure, but you'll have to believe me. There's another pot in Alma Tadema's, all on canvas here, and that is the Colchester Vase. You can just make it out in the original, or an original print of this. You can very much see Memnon. He's one of the gladiators raising his sword there. So Tadema must have seen these two pots. And again, I don't know at what point in time, because the Colchester Vase has always, to my knowledge, been in Colchester, whereas the Charioteer has, I believe, always been at the British Museum, and obviously he's created this scene. But it's lovely to see these two pottery vessels together, and I don't know why I haven't done it. I keep meaning to put this out there and get people to try and investigate and see if we can find out what the other pots are. I'm sure that one on the left there has got a depiction of Hercules or a god. And we've got these mosaics as well in this inscription, and I'm sure he was drawing on real life objects. So this is a bit of an aside, but I think this is a fascinating thing really to explore a bit further. So to whiz over the vase's production, it's thrown on a wheel, like Roman pottery is for the most part. Decoration is added at what's called the lever hard stage. It's decorated, it's often said, in barbotine. Barbotine decoration is normally applied sort of directly to the pot. But Joanna was saying there's evidence that some of the basic shapes are made separately. So this is quite a complicated way of manufacturing this decoration. Once it's dried, it's dipped in a color coat to give it that external color. And then once that's dried, the inscription is then cut below the rim of the vase. We'll talk about the inscription in a minute. And then Joanna said it's fired in a three-phase system with lots of oxidation reducing stages. So this is all about how much oxygen is and isn't in the kiln. You can probably tell I'm not a pottery expert, but Joanna said this is a really complicated process, and the vase is an exceptionally made vessel. The title of their paper, Joanna and Nina's paper, is a master potter. I think that's what we're seeing here, an absolute master of their craft. There's some evidence that the vase may have been produced by Septus III, and these potters may well have emigrated from East Gaul and the Rhineland, and that sort of makes sense now because these people are potentially they're making Samian ware, which is a really specialist ware out there. They're coming over, reapplying their trade, and so it's specialists who have made the Colchester vase. And it should be added, you can see on the right here that Colchester, I think there's two places in Britain that have been said to be manufacturing Samian, but Colchester is the biggest place because we've got all these amazing molds. So great evidence that we've got these specialist potters coming over from East Gaul, the Rhineland, setting up shop outside Colchester, outside the town, and making these amazing products. So onto the decorations. This is what Nina investigated. So I've said we've got three scenes on the vase, en barbotine, but as I've said, Joanna says it's a little bit more complicated than that. Scene one, so that's on the far left here, and we can trace this order, by the way. You can probably see on the left-hand image and the right-hand image, you've got this dotted line, and this sort of frames everyone, and that's sort of put on last, but you very much can see division. So there are very much three scenes going on here in one order or another. So we have two bestiarii. So these are sort of animal sort of fighters, sometimes differentiated between venators, who are another type of beast fighter, maybe slightly more skilled. I don't know. Sometimes they're depicted slightly differently. They're baiting a bear, and you're going to have to believe me, it's a bear. Someone always asks this at the end of the talk when I do this talk. They say, how do you know that's not a dog? That's a dog, it's not a bear. But believe me, we think it's a bear. We've then got the main event. And when I say main event, the main event of any spectacular in the arena would have been the gladiatorial fight. So, the fighting with animals, the baiting of animals with men sometimes, no doubt was fantastic, if not horrid in other ways, but you weren't really coming for that. You were really coming, if they were going to put on a fight between gladiators, that was the prime event, and it normally happened in the afternoon. So you'd have sort of animal hunts, fights in the morning, then a bit of light lunch with an execution, and then a bit of gladiator combat in the afternoon. But this could have been different across the empire. We've had to piece this together from ancient sources, especially Marshall, who comments on the opening of the Colosseum and all the amazing things that went on there. But then, of course, the Colosseum is unique. It's the emperor's arena. It's their playground. They're putting on some of the most spectacular things ever seen. So not a good example. But in general terms, we think this is the order of a day at the games. And then lastly, I think it took Nina a bit of convincing from me. We have another animal hunt, but to my mind, this is a bit of filler on the pot, and we'll come on to what's going on with the pot. But I think we've got two very, very specific scenes executed amazingly. You can see the detail here. We've got this inscription that is very personal. And then we've got something you can find pretty much on any Barbertine vessel, especially that's being produced in the Nene Valley. So to my mind, this is a bit of filler. And we can talk about this in a bit. Maybe I can come back and reference it. But anyway, there we go. 3 scenes on the pot. And the inscription is naming these performers you can see in the Venatio, so the sort of animal baiting scene there, and the Munus, so the gladiatorial fight. So decoration, scene 1. So we've got these 2 individuals. I'm just going to put a fair bit of detail on here, partly to really emphasize how sort of closely observed these individuals are in their arms and their armor and their garb. There's loads of detail here. So for instance, I know you can read this on the screen, we've got a little bit, I think the little bells or something have been said might be strapped to some of these guys, sort of noise making instruments to attract the bear. The 2 bestiarii here, Secundus and Mari, are slightly different. They're armored in a different way, if you can call padding armor. To some degree it is. I think a really interesting observation by Nina is that we always see these as 2 individuals, but maybe it's a 3. Maybe the bear is the 3rd part of this act. So maybe they're not, they're whipping this bear. They're not stabbing him, killing him with spears. So maybe this is an act. It's not a killing the bear to the death. Maybe. Bears, evidence of bears in Britain, incredibly rare, actually. Someone should really do a bit of work on this, I think. I think it's ripe for a bit of study, because at Colchester we have evidence of bear bones from several sites, but you do have to go through grey literature reports and sort of know the site. So I think this is ripe for exploration, bears in Roman Britain. And I think actually the Trust have excavated the site, and they thought they had some sort of much later bear baiting going on, and they've had it radiocarbon dated, and it's Roman. So again, that's another piece of evidence from Colchester for the presence of bears. And if we compare this to other products from Colchester, other sort of colour-coded wares, we've got a few other bears popping up, and we've got this other lovely, quite amazing pot here. You can see it's been filled in a little bit. This has been decorated with genii caculati. So these are sort of the little small hooded people. These genii, they run around the base of this pot. But then we also have a very similar figure here who seems to be sort of, again, baiting a very similar looking bear or dog, if you don't believe me, but I think another bear. So there's evidence in the archives of Colchester Museums of other examples of the pottery industry that's producing these very specific pots, which I'm about to argue, are commissioned because they're not really repeated anywhere else. So very, very specific scenes. So then on to scene 2. So as I said, the main act. So we have Memnon here. He's on the left, and he's a secutor gladiator. And I should say, the Romans really like this pairing of gladiators. It's something we explore in the current exhibition, and we really looked at the Colchester exhibition. It's what really makes the fights, the combats really interesting. Here we have a really heavily armored secutor. Okay, he's got this huge shield, the scutum. He's got padding, greaves on his legs, on his arms. There's padding. The helmet up against a retiarius. He really is not that well protected. He's got the gallerus, so this sort of shoulder armor going up. Yes, he's got his net and his trident. Some quite strange weapons there. And this makes just the games that more interesting. And this is a really popular pairing in this period of time, 2nd into 3rd century AD. Saying that, the Memnon, the Secutor, he's got a lovely helmet on, but that's going to be really restrictive. You know, in the exhibition, we tried to pose the question, what's it like putting one of those on? You know, it's incredibly heavy. You know, gladiator helmets are supposed to weigh sort of double what a military helmet is. He's got reduced vision. What's his breathing like in that sort of metal helmet? Being encased in that. They're shifting around on sand in bare feet. So if you look very carefully, they don't wear shoes, gladiators. You know, these greaves and other things stop above the foot. They've got nothing on their feet. So they're moving around in shifting sand. He's got this heavy thing on. Although fights may have lasted 10, maybe 15 minutes, you know, it's not the hour slog we see in Ridley Scott's films, or that's sort of what it feels like when you're watching it. This stuff really weighs you down. So all of this adds to the dramatics of it. Who's going to win? And again, these two gladiators, I think, are really closely observed by the potters. And it's interesting. We do wonder, you know, had these potters seen this fight that's happening here, or many other fights? Because the two gladiators look like they're really well executed. And interestingly, the bear isn't. And I was revisiting this earlier today, and I thought it is interesting how the bear doesn't look like a bear, but the gladiators here are spot on. And not only that, you sort of see the fluid motion of them and how they're presented on the vase. It really is exceptional. Someone always points out the swastika or gammadion on the shield. And just to say, if you don't know, back in the Roman period, you know, this is a really ancient symbol and a symbol of fortune, which has later been appropriated by the far right, of course, and others later, and it's now a hate symbol. But just so you know, if you didn't know, it is important to say that was a lucky symbol and is a really ancient old symbol, meaning that. And just to say, we're at a certain stage of the fight here. So Valentinus, I should say, has raised his digit. This is the symbol of his submission. His trident's on the ground there. Memnon has raised his sword, and this is really interesting because we don't know what happens next. So the potter has captured a moment in time, and it's rather fantastic. And we'll, I suppose, never know what happened to Valentinus. Did he survive or not? Did Memnon execute him within the arena? Was he shouted on by the crowd? You know, the crowd could influence the decision, but ultimately that decision was made by the sponsor of the games. They may have spoken to the gladiator owner because the sponsor didn't own the gladiator, but ultimately it was their decision. And if there was a death, there was probably a big payout. This is another thing. Trained gladiators weren't dying left, right, and center all the time. All these lanista would have been out of business, these gladiator trainers. So, you know, the gladiators are a huge investment in terms of time, resource, etc. In this instance, we don't know what happens. So the story stops here, so to speak. Moving on to the inscription. So this is the work John Pearce at King's College London undertook. We just revisited it. It has been published in the Roman Inscriptions of Britain. So again, if you don't know, all inscriptions from Britain are published in monographs and then every year in the Journal Britannia. And it is a really fantastic resource for Britain, and you'll find that published there. And the interpretation here is that we have several names. So Secundus, reading from the left to the right, Secundus, then Mario, Memnon, Secutor. So this is an abbreviation here. You could also argue it could be interpreted as a scaver, which means left-handed. He is left-handed, but John's preferred reading is Secutor. 9 fights, and this isn't some sort of scratched on in the 21st century. The Romans did write their numerals like that. We write the Roman numeral 9 with an I, then an X, but this is perfectly legitimate if you've picked up on that and you're thinking that doesn't look right. And then we have Valentinus of the 30th Legion, and in brackets, John has put Tyro because he's not got a number to his name, a number of fights. So a Tyro is the lowest ranking in the hierarchy of gladiators, the lowest ranking of gladiators, untested. So in some ways, maybe it's not unusual that Valentinus has lost here to Memnon, who's got 9 fights to his name. And 9 fights would probably place you in the category of veteran. So a really seasoned gladiator. That might not sound like a lot, but if you take in the figures and the facts from across the empire, 9 fights is a good number of fights to have behind you. So he'd be described in Latin, veteran. So moving on, I said Roman inscriptions of Britain. That's where this inscription was published. Published it or classifies it as being incised on vessels after firing. However, I've got a lovely detail here, and I hope you can see it on your screen. So the calligraphic quality and the fluidity is absolutely unparalleled in this category. So at the top here, I've put in a little sherd. So I should say this isn't a color-coded piece of pottery. This is a burnished piece of pottery, so it's slightly different. But you can see on the top piece where someone's cut into it, it almost looks ground. And if you see it in the flesh, it's really bitty, it's a bit jaggedy. If this was done onto a slipware, you'd also find the slip potentially pinging off and cracking. So that's cut post-firing. And the vase is nothing like that. So we believe the inscription was cut pre-firing and it's not a later graffiti to the pot. The deciding evidence around that, and you can see it here, is the superimposition of the strokes. So if you look at the X's, you can see how one has been drawn across and then another line has been drawn diagonally too, and it cuts through. And there's no conceivable way you can do that on a fired pot. It just wouldn't look like that. It would, in this particular instance, it would crack. You can also see the puncture of maybe the stylus that was doing this. You can see the flare at the top of the letter there. You know, you've got something similar up with Sabina there, but I think this is quite different. But this you couldn't do this on a fired pot. It has to be wet clay. So that means this isn't a later addition to the pot. It's got to be conceptualized, if you like, at the start, i.e. this has got to be a commission piece. Someone has gone to the potter and gone, I want this pot, I want you to show these people, and this is how I want you to record it. So our argument is that this actually then records a real spectacle between actual gladiators and bestiarii from Britain. And that is the first and only evidence, if you like, of a real combat between known gladiators. People often say, well, you know, the arenas up and down the country are evidence for that. But, you know, where is the evidence of the combat within those amphitheatres? There isn't. Indeed, you know, amphitheatres are very, very clean. The ones that are excavated, you hardly find anything there. I think that's the same with Chester, London, Silchester. You know, we're not finding all these bones of bears and other animals there. That's probably because these arenas are being kept very clean. They're replenishing the sand. I mean, that's argued by Tony Wilmot and the other authors at Chester. They're replenishing the sand, which keeps, you know, it hygienic, removing all that blood and all those other bodily fluids that are spilt there. So they're very clean places, which of course is awful for us archaeologists 2,000 years later. So I would again emphasize, you know, really this is the only actual evidence for a real spectacle that's taken place in Britain. So something that does come up a lot, and this is what really set people off at the start, is what about the 30th Legion it mentions? Because I'm sure a number of you will know that legion is garrisoned at Xanten, and it's never garrisoned in Britain. And Toynbee, so I referenced her book earlier, and indeed in that little catalogue entry you saw, she suggests that maybe legions possess their own troops of gladiators. And John sort of takes this a bit further, and he very much thinks, you know, Valentinus's affiliation, it's all part of the procurement and supply of animals and human performers across the provinces. I said it earlier, but spectacles in the arenas in the Roman period, a huge business, and it is an absolute machine. It needs a machine like the military to operate this, keep supplying these people and these animals to the arenas again and again and again, and not just the Colosseum, throughout the empire. There is some supporting evidence for this. We've got some nice inscriptions out there that sort of talk about capturing bears. We have reference to a vivarium, that's an animal enclosure just outside Rome. And we also have a dedication that ties into the 30th Legion at Xanten, so a bear catcher. So you can start to see how the military are performing a role in this, supplying these amphitheatres. Just checking my time, don't want to run out of time, or I might whiz through this. So what's going on with this pot then? How's it being used? And sporting memento or burial urn or both? Well, firstly, something to say about the Colchester Vase is it's an exceptionally large beaker, and it is defined as a beaker. That's what pottery specialists would call it. But a beaker you can hold in your hand and drink from is very different from the Colchester Vase, which is huge. And if, you know, think of it filled with water, incredibly cumbersome to pass around and drink from. And what is incredibly interesting about the vase, and I sort of had to do a double take when I finally sort of took it in and realized this in the flesh, it's barely got any original damage. I think it's got one crack, which is probably post-depositional when it's come out the ground, and there's no sign of use wear. So this pot is almost immaculate, which is phenomenal, really. I mean, it adds to it. It's amazingness. It suggests it's not being handled and used in a convivial setting. So you're not passing it around your banquet, your Roman banquet, as you lie down and eat and drink. And instead, we think that it's acting more as a memento of the games that it's recording. So that this object is highly prized, really looked after, and it then reaches another stage in its biography, its life, where it's reused as an urn. And this is important to state because you could argue, well, why wasn't it commissioned as a funerary urn? But decorated vessels are just not used as cremation vessels in the Roman period. I think we can only find one other example of a Barbotine vessel or, similar decoration used as a cremation vessel. This is the Toronto Hunt Cup. It's known as that. It's originally from Cambridgeshire area, Neem Valley. It's now in the Royal Ontario Museum in Canada. I mean, it's back in the day when they did museum swapsies. It's very comparable to the Colchester Vase in size and width and height. Very interestingly, it's also decorated with a scene of Venators, including one attacking a bear. Quite different figures. You can see a different style, but obviously something's going on here. And it was also found with two large sculptures. These aren't in Toronto. These are still in Britain, associated with monumental tomb architecture. And I spoke to Amanda Claridge, sadly no longer with us, sculpture expert, who says they look like they could be possibly horse trainers or something. So it's interesting, perhaps, that the only two decorated beakers of this style that are used as funerary urns have this connecting point of the arena or spectacles associated with the arena. But otherwise, you do get colour coat vessels being used as ancillary grave goods. We have some example of that in Colchester, but you won't find another vessel decorated to this degree that has a person in it. It's just not found. So we do believe it was made as a memento, and then it's later reused to bury a person, and we can talk about who that person might be. So very quickly, I'm going to run through the cremated remains. So again, this was a fantastic opportunity as part of the Decoding the Dead project to get osteologists on board. People aren't always familiar with this, but there's a huge amount you can say about cremations because the Romans didn't put people like we do nowadays who are crenulated. People weren't ground to ash. They didn't have ashes per se. They were put on a pyre and maybe they were burnt for a very, very, very long time. But bone would break down and you still have chunks of bone that can tell us about the person. They can still be analysed osteologically. So Emily Carroll, who undertook her PhD, I should say, in cremations, is a different art, if you like, to just study of full skeletons. We got her on board from Reading, and we had about 51% of the burned bone recovered. She could identify to skeletal sites so that she could point out where on the body it came from. We only found evidence of one individual in the vase, and their assessment has sort of proved they're male, and they're aged about 40 years at the time of death. And there's a real high burning intensity to this bone. You can just about see that, really, really white. But it's not consistent firing conditions. So there's a general lack of fragmentation. So it's not been stirred constantly, but it has been really highly burnt. And she suggests that maybe professional cremators, stories were used in this. And it sort of makes you think, we thought about this for the exhibition, how many people are being cremated outside Roman towns, where they're going, these bits, because then you're not cremated at the site of the cemetery. You're cremated in a different place, then a tokenistic amount of bone normally is taken. So, this isn't the whole person, the Colchester Vase. Some of that is taken, and then you're taken to the cemetery and you're buried there with whatever other structures and other rituals and worship that goes on there. So I think this is a really fascinating subject area, really. We're also able to do some fantastic scientific work on this, and this is by the team at Durham University, so Dr. Joanna Moore, Professor Janet Montgomery, and Dr. Jeff Nowell, and we were looking at isotopes, and I'm very quickly going to go over what this is. So if you're not familiar with this, So isotopes are they're a variant of a particular chemical element, and it's found in the bone. Um, they're like chemical signatures, and they're created by the climate and the geology of where you live, so where you sort of grew up. And often you're looking at where people grow up. It's not over the course of their lifetime. Isotope signatures are laid down very early on in the life cycle. It can be found in a very specific bone in the skull. This is near the ear. So this is called the petrous bones. You can sort of see on the image here. And of course, you will have two petrous bones, one in each ear. And in fact, I don't really advertise this, but there are two petrous bones from the Colchester Vase burial. And we only used one, and we wouldn't sample the other because this technique here is essentially destructive. So strontium isotope analysis was conducted, and essentially, have I got a? There's my little in. Essentially, this can sort of imply where people may have originated from, well, within the Roman Empire in this context. So we sampled the bone from the Petrus, the Colchester vase. It's just shown up on my little graph there. And you can see it's outside these dotted lines, which essentially means this person isn't local. So the strontium that they've taken in to their bones very early on does not match the signature that you will find in the natural underlying rocks and the strontium of Colchester or Essex. And that's quite clear on this graph. So it suggests they could have come from somewhere else in Britain, or northern Italy, or northern Greece, or Pannonia, or Bavaria. The problem we have here is what we're missing is the oxygen isotope analysis. And the reason we can't do oxygen isotope analysis is that this is a cremation that has been burnt out of the bone. Now, normally, if you can do both of these, and this isotope analysis has been done all the time for inhumation burials, it acts as sort of two points of contact, and you can pin down potentially where someone was born or where they grew up very early on. You can't do that with cremations, unfortunately. So this might sound a bit wishy-washy. However, although this suggested, they could be from the Mediterranean, it's a bit of a punt. They could also be from other extreme places in Britain. We were sort of pushed back on the results of this. When we tried to publish this, peer review said, why haven't you done lead isotope analysis? And that's partly because I don't think anyone was really doing lead isotope analysis on cremations, maybe a few academics in Germany. But Dr. Joanna Moore took this on, and she did a PhD, I think, in the study of lead and isotopes, and has done a huge amount of work on this. And we've resubmitted the same petrous bone, and we were able to resubmit it for the lead isotope analysis. And this is hot off the press, by the way. This isn't published, and it's something we'll hopefully get into print in a year's time or so, and then do some bit of PR around it. But it does confirm with that lead and that strontium that this individual in the Colchester vase is most likely from the Mediterranean, a bit like this graph on the right. They're way out of any normal parameters for Britain, and we do have sort of really good understanding of lead in Britain. So that'll be coming out in a forthcoming paper at some point. It's been submitted, I think. We're just sort of waiting. It's quite a long process. So, I've been talking about this individual in this pot. Then you're probably all thinking, so who's in this pot? And we're sort of coming to the conclusion here, really. Well, whoever they are, they're going to have had a really special relationship I think to the events depicted on that pot. So those people, if you're going to be cremated and stuck in the pot, certainly in Colchester, it's a greyware vessel. That's just what you do. There's nothing wrong with that. That was perfectly acceptable to the Romans. It wasn't a bad burial. That's what you did. So this really stands out as very, very odd. Why would you be buried in a pot? So there must have been some relationship, and you assume a very special relationship, to the events that are depicted, this actual combat, this real life event. Lots of people would like to think maybe it's one of the gladiators depicted. So is it the victor Memnon? Was it Valentinus? Maybe he was spared his life and this was a record of it. But that's potentially slightly odd. That's not really how gladiators honor themselves in death and burial. We have the tombstone on the right here, which is in the exhibition, touring exhibition. This is Helios. He's from Halicarnassus, and this is from the Gladiator Cemetery at Halicarnassus. And this is more, the type of tomb marker, or this is a tombstone that gets erected normally by burial clubs, gladiators. They're enslaved peoples. They're paying into a burial club, so ultimately they're looked after in death. This is really important in the Roman world, especially when you won't have the funds to do that yourself. So odds, this isn't sort of how they would normally honor themselves. And if you were commissioning this vessel, why would you present it in that way? I suppose we can sort of think about that specific scene. Although you're not obviously commissioning it for your death, but the victory at hand. Having said all this, you can probably tell this isn't quite what I think, and it's not the conclusion we came to. We argue that I think it's far more likely that the vases may be commissioned by a lanista, so that's a trainer of gladiators, or indeed an editor, a sponsor of the games. And we think that maybe that's who is buried in this pot. I mean, whoever, the dead don't bury themselves. That's that famous phrase by Mike Parker Pearson. So someone has put this individual into this pot. And I like to think, maybe it's I don't know, a long-suffering wife, and they're obsessed with this pot throughout their lifetime. It's always on display. No one can touch it. And what they eventually do is bury their other half in this pot. I don't know. But whatever the case, there's got to be some special connection between the person who owned that, potentially commissioned it, and I'm assuming here the person who ends up in it as well. So in conclusion, then, if we zoom out a bit, so I've spoken all night on this one object, as fantastic as it is one object. I just want to put it in context of the exhibition you've seen, or if you've not seen, you need to go and see. Spectacular. So these spectacles that are put on. So the evidence, across Britain, it really is quite sparse, and it's less than sparse. It's disparate. We have to look to a lot of different sources to put together that picture. A day at the games, what did that look like, or the activity in the arenas across the country. And I do admit, we've got amphitheatres up and down the country, but what story is that telling us? So the exhibition is really drawing together some of the most recent new analyses and evidence that suggests spectacular took place here. So, of course, we have the Colchester Vase, so we're talking about potentially real combatants, likely originating outside of Britain, Valentinus connected with the 30th Legion there. There's also the Hawkden helmet, so you can see on the right here, this fantastic helmet that we commissioned a replica for of the visor, and this is really interesting actually. And I will say that this potentially is the helmet of a procurator, I think is the name. Basically, it's not a secutor, it's not a freyex, it's another gladiator type that's sort of unattested in Britain, but it is elsewhere. It's a very popular gladiator type elsewhere. And that was recreated by a specialist at the BM, their replica maker. So this has had new analyses done it, and we know for a fact now, so it's Peter Bray and his team at the University of Reading, their Remade project, looking at copper alloy bronze objects. We know this is made in Italy, this helmet. It correlates, it matches specifically to the metals out there. And so this has come in from Italy, it's come into Britain, it's been imported. And then, of course, hopefully you've all read about the new evidence from Driftfield Terrace. This is a cemetery in York. It's a possible gladiator cemetery, although John thinks it really is a gladiator cemetery. It's an amazing site that could do with a lot more write-up, actually. One of those individuals there, they have a bite mark on their pelvis. So one of the skeletons, one of the individuals, potential gladiator, has a bite mark. And this amazing research by Tim Thompson, a number of other academics, it's fantastic research, actually. It really is amazing. And they've sort of scanned this bite and sort of flipped the image and worked out what will have punctured into it. And they believe that it's a big cat and probably a lion. And this is the first evidence of, sort of, as I've put here, human-animal gladiatorial combat anywhere in the Roman period. So again, yes, other sources, we know they were exploiting these animals. They were going all over the place, being destroyed in arenas. But this is the first evidence for that interaction, and that's phenomenal. And the exhibition brings this all together. So my last sort of concluding remark tonight, before I take questions, if you sort of step back a little bit, is where between the vase and the helmet and the bike mark, you're really looking at this huge mobility of people and equipment and animals coming into Britain, and how important Roman spectacle was. Culturally, it's incredibly important to the Romans. at the that phrase, whether you like it or not, at the edge of empire. And I think all of this together is painting quite a different picture of the reality of gladiators in Britain. And I'm going to stop talking there.
Oh, thank you so much, Glynn. That